Okay, we're going to get started. Take a seat. Okay, welcome to the morning session. The theater has asked me to send out a little announcement saying no coffee in the theater. I see you people at the front. Don't let them see you. Okay, so we've got another jam-packed jam-packed set of sessions today. For this morning's session on animal consciousness meets theory of consciousness, I'm now going to hand over to our awesome morning chair, Heather Berlin, professor of psychiatry and cognitive neuroscientist at Mount Sinai and Cornell Medical School.
Hey, thank you. So this morning we're going to hear a little bit about theories of consciousness and how they relate to animal consciousness. And I think ultimately we'll have to fundamentally agree on an overarching theory of consciousness that might help us answer a lot of these questions. So the first speaker today is Peter Carruthers. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland's College Park with a strong interest in philosophy of mind and in the cognitive sciences. He's also a member of he's associate member of the Neuroscience and Cognitive Science program at the University of Maryland and he's on the committee for philosophy and the sciences. So please welcome Peter Carruthers.
Okay, so someone needs to press the little button to get this up. Someone press a button. So where's the tech guy? Hooray, thank you. Okay, so time is even shorter, so I'll dive straight in. So first off, just a little bit on what our topic is, because I think that yesterday it wasn't entirely clear in every session exactly what we were talking about. So just to stress, this is about phenomenal consciousness. That's a property of mental states, so we're not talking about conscious versus unconscious organism. Right, so the awake-asleep distinction, I mean, that's an interesting distinction. It's quite hard to know exactly what the mechanisms are that regulate it, but that's not our topic. Nor is it about, in my view, mere perception. There are many forms of unconscious perception, and I'll talk about some of those a bit later. Rather, it's about the kinds of perceptual states and other kinds of states that are phenomenal, right, that feel like something, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So everyone can agree that consciousness is first personal, right? It's the way it feels like to us when we have conscious experiences. And I think that means that theorizing about consciousness has to begin from the human case. It's the only case in which we have first-person access to phenomenal consciousness, so you need to build a theory for the human case and then start to extend it out to animals. Okay, so now I'm going to draw a contrast between two very different approaches to the theories of consciousness. One is Qualia Realism, which I'll just sketch what its implications are and then say I reject it. So some people, of course, believe in intrinsic properties of experience, that there are qualia, where qualia are the phenomenal properties of experience. And then, of course, if you have such a view, you need to ask, well, which events do qualia attached to in humans, right? So what's our best theory of the neural and functional correlates of qualia in humans? And people who believe in qualia have different views on this one, but they can endorse a global broadcasting theory of the sort that was first put forward, I think, by Bernie Bars and later taken up by Michael Tighe independently, and has been pushed really hard over recent years by Stan Dehaene and his lab in Paris. I think myself that this is our best empirical theory of the conscious-unconscious distinction. I think there's lots of stuff that's now supporting it. I'm not going to argue in favor of it. I'm just going to use it from here on in and assume that this is true, and then ask how things look about the distribution of phenomenal consciousness across the animal world. So I think if this is our best theory, it's going to be obvious that animals will undergo states that are more or less similar to human forms of global broadcasting, just because, excuse me, just because the architectures of their minds are very different, can be very different, sometimes more similar, sometimes less so, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But given those more or less similarities, the point I want to make here is just that for qualia realists, it's going to be a substantive, factual question which of those states possess intrinsic qualia, right? That there's got to be some point in the more or less like global broadcasting that we find in non-human animals where qualia first start to attach to the events in question. Okay, so my assumptions, in contrast, I already said I agree with global broadcasting theory. I want to combine that with reductive representationism. So on this view, phenomenal experiences are just a certain kind of intentional representational content, playing a certain kind of role, in particular, being globally broadcast. Hence, there are no qualia, there's no intrinsic properties of experience. More specifically, I think that consciousness is globally broadcast non-conceptual content. So I think that other kinds of content can be globally broadcast. I think that conceptual information can be. I just don't think that that contributes constitutively to the phenomenal properties of the experiences that result. But that's another kind of debate and you know, not really relevant to what I'm talking about today. So I'll just assume globally broadcast non-conceptual content. So just to note, this is a theory that says you can reduce phenomenal consciousness to a distinctive combination of a certain kind of content and a certain kind of causal role, right? The content is non-conceptual content, the causal role is being globally broadcast, okay? Nevertheless, this kind of theory can, I think, explain the temptation to believe in qualia, and that's going to be an advantage in any theory, since so many people are tempted to believe in them. So in particular, hard problem type thought experiments, right? So the familiar zombies and what Mary didn't know and so on, can be said to arise because we have, can form purely recognitional concepts of experience. And having got such a concept, you can think thoughts like there could be a being like me in all physical, functional, intentional respects who lacks this experience, right? Or this R. Where this R is standing in for a recognitional concept of experience that has no analog in public language. It's a concept you can form for yourself in your own case. And I found by experience that you have to get students to form these concepts for themselves first to get gripped by the problem of zombies at all. And similarly, you can think, you know, when Mary leaves her room, she'll learn that red tomatoes give rise to this R, and you can think about what Mary learns. But that's just about concepts. It's nothing about, shows nothing distinctive about the properties that they're picking out. Okay, so global broadcasting theory then. In humans, there's a sharp step function for the conscious-unconscious distinction. I mean, Dan Dennett once thought that consciousness might be a kind of fame in the brain, and that was sort of right, except that fame admits of degrees, right? You can be more or less famous. And it turns out the evidence suggests that no, consciousness isn't fame in the brain. It's either you're globally famous or you're not famous at all. So there's no degrees of broadcasting. Either the neural populations in question hit a threshold, in which case they are globally broadcast, or they don't, in which case they gradually fade away while having a variety of other effects. Nevertheless, the global broadcasting architecture will vary by degrees across species. So when people talk about what global broadcasting is, they'll characteristically mention a bunch of different systems that conscious experiences get broadcast to. So systems for generating verbal reports, for higher order awareness of one's own experiences, executive function, long-term memory, sustained affective reactions, and so on. And, well, quite obviously, not all of these are present in other animals. Verbal report isn't. Capacity for higher order thought will be present in some other animals, but not all. And executive function is itself multi-component, multifunctional. So there's a whole bunch of things that get collected together under executive functions in humans. There's capacities to select actions, mentally rehearse actions, inhibit actions, form intentions for the future, implement intentions, direct your attention, search memory, and so on. And I think there's reason to think that these functions are all partly dissociable from one another. You can vary the properties of one without affecting the others, and in some cases you can lose some without losing the others. And all of the systems mentioned will, of course, have differing degrees of internal complexity across not just people, but across species. And across species, there will be lots of different degrees of conceptual sophistication that go into the operations of these different systems. So I take it as just an obvious implication of global broadcasting theory that global broadcasting is a matter of degree across species. And then, of course, you can ask the question, well, given we got a global broadcasting theory of consciousness, what should we say about the consciousness case? Well, first shot would be to say, well, degrees of consciousness, right? The degree of conscious experience possessed by a given species is going to be a function of its degree of similarity to the human global broadcasting case, right? Now, as I already remarked, I mean, conscious experience is all or none in humans, and I've come across some people who think that it's some sort of conceptual truth that consciousness is all or none. I mean, I guess Qualia Realists might think this. I don't really care. I don't do concepts myself. It's pretty clear that the property picked out, that's to say globally broadcast non-conceptual content, isn't all or none, right? So even if the concept of consciousness is all or none, the property that it's referring to is not. And then there can be degrees of that property exemplified across species. But I think the similarities are likely to be really complicated, multifaceted, cross-cutting, right? So you're not going to find a nice, neat, linear relationship across species, no matter how you line them up, in degrees of global broadcasting. You're going to get cross-cutting similarities. So I think there is no single similarity metric out there waiting to be discovered, right? You could impose one, but there isn't one to be discovered. Moreover, you might wonder what would set the 0 point for the degrees of global broadcasting, right? So when is there no global broadcasting at all? And that suggests a slightly different approach, right? And you could tackle that by saying, well, perhaps you can define a vague categorical boundary. And here's how it would go. You'd say a conscious experience in a species is that experience being more similar to the human global broadcast case than the human unconscious experience, right? So unconscious experience has been investigated in humans using the same first-person methods that we use to investigate consciousness. There's a variety of different kinds. There's the dorsovisual motor control system that deals with the details of one's movements when acting, but doesn't issue in conscious experience. I think the same system underlies habitual action and guides habitual action. There's sleepwalking. There's unattended percepts, which don't make consciousness, but have a variety of other effects on behavior and thought. There's swift activation of affective motor responses. There's unconscious affective learning, and so on. So the idea would be we've got a sample of kinds of unconsciousness, and we've got consciousness, and perhaps you can define conscious states as those that are closer to the one than the other. So it would be a bit like picking on a shade of central red and saying, well, red is any shade that's more similar to this than it is to central yellow. One problem here, though, I think, is that it's far from clear how we would know that there aren't many forms of unconscious experience that aren't similar to either. Right? So we've got human forms of unconscious experience, and we've got human forms of conscious experience, and how do we know that there's lots of variations in between that would not fit either pattern? I mean, so it'd be a bit like saying central red is more similar to central, sorry, that red is anything that's more similar to central red than central blue, which of course would be a mistake because there's all kinds of colors in between that aren't red. Okay. And I think the proposal here seems to presuppose an already given discoverable similarity metric again, right? And so to reiterate, I think there's unlikely to be anything like a linear similarity space. Okay, so where do we go from here then? I think the upshot is that the issue of consciousness in animals is stipulative, not substantive. There isn't a substantive question to answer. So suppose we had complete knowledge of the systems and functioning, the cognitive organization of a chicken or a salmon or a honeybee, you know, pick your favorite species, right? Suppose we'd got to the point where we understand exactly what all the systems are and how they're interacting. What would be added by saying that it's conscious or not conscious, or conscious to degree n rather than degree m if you've got some sort of similarity going? On this view, nothing lights up, right? Remember, this is reductive representationism I'm pushing. There's no intrinsic qualia. There's nothing special that's going to be there. What gets added is just categorizing it as conscious or conscious to a certain degree. And that would be something that we'd have to stipulate. It's not something that you could discover, right? Remember, I'm imagining that we've discovered everything that there is to discover about the cognitive organization, and so everything there is to discover about the extent to which this is global broadcasting-like and not global broadcasting-like. So I think the upshot is we should go home and stop asking about animal consciousness. But not because they aren't, but rather because there's no fact of the matter. Right? When you start from this first personal sense and get a good theory of what human consciousness is, when you turn to the animal case, there's going to be kinds of similarity and kinds of dissimilarity, and there's no substantive question about whether they're really conscious or not really conscious, or conscious to some degree. And I think focusing on the question of consciousness in animals just distracts us from the hard and substantive scientific question of how their minds are organized and function. And we should not be hung up on whether to categorize that organization as conscious or not. We should just be trying to figure out how they work. And I also think that the focus distracts from the moral question of the extent to which minds organized like that matter. Right? I think as we saw from the discussion yesterday, people are using consciousness as a kind of magic bullet. They think that all we have to settle is whether an organism is conscious, and then it's going to matter, and that'll settle the thing. And what we ought to be looking at is rather the details of the cognitive organization and the kinds of mental states they have, and then addressing the moral question of, does that matter? To what extent does it matter? Okay, that's me done, thanks.
So we have time for some questions. Right here in the middle, here. Do you want a mic? Yeah.
So that was really very interesting, because it seems like you took Stanislav Dehaene's global broadcasting view, stripped away this qualia component, and basically, it seems to me, and you know, as a neuroscientist, I'm very sympathetic to it, is that we should be doing more, you know, particularity in our study of the nervous system, but it takes away anything easy as a kernel to philosophize about for the philosophers. Which is interesting, because if they don't have their thing to talk about and to say is present or not present.
I'm quite happy to put us out of business.
Yes, but do you see, I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious. In a way, it seems that you're saying we need to do detailed neuroscience and basically to characterize the systems like Stan is doing in Paris. But philosophy seems to be somewhat exempt from this project. I mean, is that fair to say?
Partly. I mean, in Colin Allen's talk yesterday, he was not taking the same position, but stressing that we needed to understand the details of the minds of different fish and how they're organized in different fish. I mean, I still think he thought there was a substantive question about whether they'd be conscious or not, but stressing the details of needing to understand particular particular minds out there, I think is exactly right, and that's what we ought to be focusing on. Whether it would put philosophy out of business, well, no, I think what I'm doing is philosophy. It's just I think we should stop worrying about the problem of consciousness across species.
Hi, Peter. I thought it was interesting that you were willing to cede the human case to the on-off people. I mean, it's a useful approximation to think of global broadcasting theory in humans as a step function, but of course there are many degrees of fame, pretty much however you spell it out. You know, I mean, you can think of sort of network connection strength, broadcast, you know. So, I mean, it seems like if you really go down this path, you're going to have to make the same concessions about humans. I mean, suppose Ned is just better myelinated than me, and his things broadcast much more efficiently than mine do. Maybe I'm a borderline case of consciousness, and maybe there's no fact of the matter, and who cares? I mean, would you bite?
I don't see that I have to go down that route. I mean, so what you might well get is degrees of the precision of the content of the experiences in question, degrees in the speed with which they reach their targets, okay? But if it's true as the Tighe group have evidence that there is a step function there, right? You either get broadcasting or not. It's, I mean, maybe, yeah. So if there's evidence that broadcasting can admit of degrees, then of course I'll buy it. But as I'm reading the literature at the moment, there isn't. People will differ in the extent to which they can do something with the contents in question, how vague or indeterminate those contents will be, but not in whether it's conscious or not.
Peter, that was lovely. I agree with, I think, all of it, except for one policy issue. It may have been a typo or a misprint. You spoke about unconscious experience in humans. You mean unconscious cognitive phenomena. You don't want to, right?
Look, I think this is just a verbal thing,
Yeah,
but it's not. It's not a misprint. I've always been happy to talk about unconscious experience. I don't have the same intuitions that other people have that experience is sort of definitionally conscious. But yeah, so if you want to say unconscious percepts or unconscious representational states, it's fine with me.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said that by consciousness you mean phenomenal consciousness, and by phenomenal consciousness you mean felt. Is that correct? By the way, in asking that, I don't mean that I agree that there's any other kind of consciousness. The felt consciousness is the only kind of consciousness by my lights. But what do you have to say about that? And what do you mean when you say, well, we have to find out how this is distributed in the animal kingdom and then figure out what matters? I don't think you're suggesting that maybe hurting feelings doesn't matter.
So felt is the technical term that people use for the feely quality of experience, right?
Same
and
thing.
It has a slightly different sense when you talk about bodily sensations. So I think there can be unfelt bodily sensations.
That's back to what Dan asked about.
Right. Yeah, okay.
But I'm not asking about
No,
that.
no, okay.
I'm talking about the felt ones. I don't know what those other things are.
So, yes, there's pains and pain-like feelings across many different organisms that will play somewhat different roles across those organisms, as we started to hear yesterday. And I think exactly the same question is going to arise, right? To what extent does this negatively valent state in this organism playing this kind of role matter, either to the organism itself or to us, versus another kind of organization? So yeah, of course there's pains in other creatures, or pain-like states, if that's the better way to go, if you don't want to assume that there's an identity of kind of state, as I wouldn't.
I've had the mic for a while. Can I ask my question? Thank you, very kind. So, Peter, I think I agree with most of what you said, except what I think I don't agree with is your characterization of your position. That is to say, when you say that the question of animal consciousness is stipulative, not substantive, that seems to suggest that in some sense it's sort of arbitrary how we decide these questions. And it seems to me that actually what you're showing is that questions of animal consciousness are not at least entirely empirical, but have strong conceptual elements to how we decide these questions, where by conceptual elements I mean we're going to go for one of these responses rather than another, in part because it's going to hang together with the best theoretical structure of the world that we have, how we make distinctions in other domains, and so on. And actually, I would go further and also say that, in fact, how we think about the moral and evaluative questions are not some sealed off, discrete, independent domain, but actually interact very strongly with the kind of conceptual categorization we do. So it seems to me that it's not the right picture to say these are stipulative questions, as if there are no considerations, important considerations that bear on how we actually decide to carve up the world in terms of the conscious, non-conscious.
I think I agree with that.
So I'm having trouble figuring out what it is that you're against. You say you're in favor of phenomenal consciousness, you're against qualia. But when you talk about qualia, you label them as intrinsic qualia. You never said what that meant. So usually intrinsic means something like non-relational. Now I count myself as a realist about qualia and phenomenal consciousness. But I don't think that qualia are intrinsic. I think the best kinds of theories we have favor something like recurrent processing in sensory areas, something like that. Now, so this makes me wonder what it is. From the point of view of what I think, I'm having trouble figuring out whether I agree with you or not. The main difference is that I reject the global workspace view. I favor some view in a direction where we don't have a very well spelled out theory. So I think it's really unknown what consciousness is in the brain, but the upshot could be quite similar to what you're suggesting. So it may be that when we figure out what kind of recurrent processing consciousness is, there will be that application of those ideas to animals will be largely indeterminate. So I'm willing to allow that could be true. So I'm just I'm really puzzled as to what calling yourself an eliminativist about intrinsic qualia really adds up to.
Well, so I think the other difference between us, I'm a global workspace theorist, not a recurrent processing theorist. The other difference between us is that I think consciousness reduces to a certain kind of content. Whereas I think, if I got it right, you think that qualia are identical with a certain kind of recurrent processing, right? So for me, phenomenal consciousness is a relational thing. It involves representation or content. And so there's actually two disagreements going on.
Yeah, no, there are these two disagreements, but they're not disagreements about realism versus anti-realism. They're disagreements about what your theory of realist phenomenal consciousness is. So look, here's what I think. I think this intrinsic qualia stuff is a made-up view that you foist on your opponents, and that the real disagreements are about what concern what the real nature of real phenomenal consciousness is. Our real disagreements are about whether global broadcasting is true, whether the representationalist account is true. They're not about whether phenomenal consciousness exists or not exists, or whether qualia exists or not exists, because you can use the word qualia and make up some view that your scientific realist opponents will never accept, like intrinsic qualia. So the real disagreements, it seems to me, are basically scientific disagreements.
Yeah, I think I'm happy with that too. Well, you want to reply?
Well, am I allowed to say one thing just really quickly? Don't let Ned get away with this. Oh, okay. He wrote a paper called Mental Paint, and the model for qualia was the paint on the painting, and that's intrinsic.
Okay, good, thank you.
We might have time for one more question. I'll take just because it's close right there. Yeah. Well, sorry. Then I promise I'll get to the back.
Well, I also like the global workspace theory, but I noticed that you were using global broadcasting. So when I think global workspace, it's because it's coming in, things are happening to it in the working memory, which you've associated with the global workspace, and then it's broadcast widely out to do certain roles. Could you say a few words about that terminology, because it may affect how we see your framing of the role of that part?
Yeah, so global workspace is about working memory. And working memory is a kind of memory, right? It has to be sustained through top-down attention and so on. Whereas I think you may be able to get, I think you probably do get momentary broadcasts which aren't sustained thereafter, right? So I think you can have information that's broadcast in the brain, but if your attention switches fast enough to something else, it isn't sustained in working memory. Okay, so I just think broadcasting is one thing, working memory is sustained broadcasting, and controlled broadcasting, as it were.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was great. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of the global workspace theory, but I think there's not consensus yet amongst neuroscientists that is the theory. So that brings me to the next speaker, Bjorn Merker, who is a Swedish neuroscientist who has done a lot of work looking at the neural basis of consciousness, and I think he feels that we don't even need a cortex for consciousness. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Bjorn Merker.
Thank you for that introduction, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to this very, very lively meeting. I hope to make it even livelier. As a neuroscientist with long-standing interest in brain mechanisms of consciousness, I would have liked nothing better today than to give you a rundown of what neuroscience can tell us about animal consciousness. There is, however, no such rundown, for the simple reason that there is no agreement in neuroscience about brain mechanisms of consciousness, let alone about a comparative account of consciousness in the animal kingdom. Instead, mutually conflicting bids for the neural key to consciousness are vying for acceptance in a manner strikingly captured in the introductory chapter of Thomas Kuhn's classic The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. There he describes the pre-science stage in the history of a discipline, a stage at which different schools are divided by fundamental disagreements touching even on first principles. As far as I can tell, Kuhn's picture of the prehistory of a science fits the state of theorizing about consciousness in neuroscience to a T. Here is my own conceptual classification scheme for the principal competing approaches to questions of consciousness in neuroscience. There are at least half a dozen distinct positions in this table with very different assumptions about what renders neural activity conscious, and therefore also with very different consequences for questions of animal consciousness. I'm referring to questions such as how far down the phylogenetic tree can we expect brains to be equipped with consciousness, or whether branches of that tree other than our own might host conscious creatures, and so on. Every theory listed here gives you different answers to such questions, so let me illustrate this by a couple of examples. On the left here, you have a grab bag of theories that assumes that beside the ordinary functional neural circuitry which neuroscientists study for a living, you have to have something in addition to that, a consciousness-specific factor, as it were, that somehow renders the neural activity conscious. Hence my name additive-based from the extra ingredient added to neural activity to make it conscious. The bids for this are many, but here is a sample. Calcium waves in glia, gamma oscillations, electromagnetic fields, quantum superpositions, superposition of the quantum wave function, cosmic primitive, experienced as a cosmic primitive. Gamma oscillations were championed in this role by Francis Crick, Christoph Koch, Wolf Singer, and others. If one takes that proposal seriously, consciousness extends all the way down to insects, because their minuscule brains abound in these kinds of oscillations. In fact, on the gamma conjecture, consciousness would extend to any creature whose brain features tight coupling between excitation and inhibition, because that is the trivial circumstance that generates gamma oscillations in neural tissue, our retina included. This is not the only awkward fact encumbering the gamma conjecture. For example, gamma is superabundant during the unconscious phase of recovery from grand mal epilepsy. Part of the appeal of the gamma conjecture, despite such awkward findings, was the claim that it solved the so-called binding problem of consciousness. However, the proponents of the binding by synchrony conjecture were apparently not sufficiently conversant with the functional architecture of mammalian brains to realize that there is no binding problem in the first place. It is a pseudo-problem, plain and simple, as was elegantly shown by Mitsuo Kawato in a completely neglected paper of 1997, and as I discussed in detail in a major review of the gamma literature in 2012. Given all this, it would be hazardous to employ gamma oscillations as a criterion for consciousness in any creature, animal or human. A theory that initially appeared to rule out consciousness in insects is Julio Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness. Early in the development of Tononi's ideas, inspired by his work with Gerald Edelman, those ideas constrained consciousness to animals with large brains equipped with neocortex-like circuitry, because the theory was based squarely on graph-theoretic summaries of cortical interareal connectivity. Soon it turned out, however, that all kinds of networks in nature, besides neural ones, deliver substantial scores on Tononi's integrated information measure, which he calls phi. For example, the metabolic pathways inside the cells that make up our body, as well as the gene expression networks of our immune system. The family resemblance between these two graphs means that both score high on Tononi's phi measure of consciousness. One summarized the human neonate gene expression network in response to infection, the other the connective networks of the human telencephalon. I'll let you guess which one is which. Even a trivial photodiode with a 1-bit memory feedback loop delivers a positive phi score, as we see here. Oops. This is Tononi's own figure. The obvious and natural conclusion of such results is that phi is not a measure of consciousness at all, but rather measures the organizational efficiency in small world networks featuring hierarchy and feedback, because that is the only thing these wildly different networks that deliver positive phi scores have in common. I shall return to Tononi later in my remarks, but for now suffice it to say that the theory that declares our immune system and simple photodiode arrangements to be conscious is going to be a rather blunt instrument for dissecting questions of animal consciousness. Each of these additional bids, format-based theories, and under format-based theories, viewpoint-based ones, has its own particular implications for consequences for our topic. But further detail would only add further disagreements among theories. If there is time, we can take a look at these categories later. But first, an even more serious theoretical divide deserves our attention. There are serious thinkers of consciousness who doubt that any of these brain-based conjectures or models will ever be able to account for key characteristics of consciousness, because those characteristics place them beyond the purview of physicalist theory as conventionally understood. When presented with one of these models, however well grounded in the facts of neurophysiology and empirical evidence it might be, these skeptics can always dismiss the proposal by saying, well, what you have described is only neurons firing, but what gives it subjectivity to render it conscious? This is an is this some water I could get? I'm a little dry in my mouth. This is an old chestnut in the annals of philosophy. It traces at least as far back as to John Locke's famous essay concerning human understanding of 1690, in which he stated his conviction that it is, and I quote, very good, thank you. It's better. It is impossible to conceive that ever bare incogitative matter should produce a thinking, intelligent being. What Locke added to bare incogitative matter to get a thinking, intelligent being was the agency of God, as part of its argument for the necessary existence of God. Fast forward almost 3 centuries to the second half of the 20th century. By that time, massive progress in understanding particular forms of organization of bare incogitative matter had revealed how some particular conformations of matter explain not only life itself, but a variety of cognitive processes which by that time were beginning to be understood in neural terms. As a consequence, some thinkers no longer felt compelled to abide by Locke's inconceivability, but started to entertain the possibility that the conscious human mind itself might indeed find an explanation in particular forms of organized matter. This met with objections from Thomas Nagel, an American philosopher and currently professor emeritus at this university, and he's gracing our assembly this morning as he did yesterday. In a famous 1974 essay, he set out to do battle against what he called this recent wave of reductionist euphoria. He did so by resorting to what we might call a thought experiment in animal consciousness, more specifically asking us to imagine what it would be like to be a bat, a creature which, without further ado, he assumed to be conscious. With its help, he launched a new post-Lockean inconceivability, namely the inconceivability of what it is like to be a bat. That inconceivability apparently was intended to place something beyond the reach of physicalist theory, or as Nagel put it, without some idea, therefore, of what the subjective character of experience is, we cannot know what is required of physicalist theory. One way to make sure that we do not have some idea of the subjective character of experience is to ask us to concretely conceive of how a sensory system that we do not possess, bat echolocation specifically, might be experienced in actual operation. That is, to imagine what it would be like to be a bat. But if the desideratum for a physicalist account of consciousness is to have some idea of the subjective character of experience, there are sources of insight far closer to us than bats, and far more directly accessible to us than through our imaginings, namely by direct acquaintance in first-hand experience. The only species regarding which we can be reasonably certain that it possesses consciousness is our own. And to say that we are conscious creatures means that we have direct acquaintance with the subjective as well as all other aspects of experience with which consciousness equips us. But Nagel's excursion into bats is crucial to his argument because it is through bats that he introduces the principal aspect of subjectivity that comes to carry the burden of his subsequent argument contra physicalist theory. That aspect is the fact that consciousness involves a point of view, an observer-specific viewpoint or perspective. By introducing that fact via a bat's viewpoint, he makes the concept of the viewpoint dependence of the contents of consciousness into something strange, exotic, and essentially unreachable, instead of what in fact it is, namely the most familiar fact of all the familiar facts of our experience, the simple circumstance that conscious contents are apprehended from a point, appropriately named viewpoint, the point being that the place occupied by ourselves as observers. That is why we cannot see the backsides of objects present in our visual field, and why no amount of measurements performed on a right-handed glove can ever distinguish that glove from its left-handed twin, as William James noted over a century ago. Having cloaked the subjectivity aspect of consciousness in mystery by introducing it via bats, Nagel then concluded his argument by placing the viewpoint dependence of consciousness in conflict with the objectivity requirements of science. He does so by construing scientific objectivity as an endeavor to make scientific accounts viewpoint independent. The viewpoint independence of science is, however, not general, but highly constrained and partial, nor does it arise from any particular concern of science to make its findings viewpoint independent. Rather, it derives from the concern of science with reliable knowledge and evidence. Science is viewpoint dependent because it arises only among conscious creatures equipped with language and a host of other cultural particulars as well. And its limited viewpoint independence derives from the fact that anyone capable of understanding its propositions and who in addition is willing to apply its strictures when relating theory to evidence is likely to share in its conclusions. Within the narrow circle of those thus constrained, that is, within the narrow circle of those thus constituted, that is, among those who share the viewpoint and perspective equipping them with the capacity to adhere to the strictures of science, other differences of viewpoint do not bear on their sharing in the conclusions of science. The same is to be expected when the strictures of science are applied to the phenomena of consciousness, and in none of its aspects more obviously so than in the one aspect that Nagel insists poses a major obstacle to a physicalist account, namely the fact that conscious contents are apprehended from a viewpoint, that is, from the place and perspective of the observer. Nagel repeatedly insists on the viewpoint dependence of conscious phenomenology, that is, for the organism that occurs in the third paragraph of his 1974 paper. But that well-taken insistence means that viewpoint dependence is an ever-present, universal, and invariant attribute of conscious functioning. Indeed, it renders the fact of the viewpoint dependence of conscious functioning independent of viewpoint, because any and every instance of consciousness has this general attribute, making it an objective property of consciousness begging for an objective physicalist account in accordance with ordinary canons of science. As the one perfectly universal attribute of consciousness, admitting of no exceptions, viewpointedness virtually defines consciousness and supplies the principal point of entry of science to consciousness as a subject matter. However, instead of recognizing this felicitous circumstance, Nagel obscures it by the problematic claim that there is something it is like to be conscious. Whatever one might think it is like to be conscious while calmly reflecting on one's own state is but one of many possible contents of consciousness. Should one at that moment smell smoke and hear sirens screaming in the street outside, the particular something one had just settled on for what it is like to be conscious will no doubt vanish to be instantly replaced by a very different one. Since the change is not accompanied by a loss of consciousness, though self-consciousness may be lost, the new something is no less a specimen of what it is like to be conscious than that which it replaced. Consciousness is capacious. It includes things like being the grip of abject fear, spirited hilarity, theorem proving, lassitude, dreaming, raging aggression, waiting for someone to lift the receiver to answer one's phone call, hallucinating, being acutely self-conscious, being confused, inebriated, or spaced out on drugs, being serenely detached and experiencing the drawing of one's last breath before dying. Why should there be anything it is like to be conscious except the bare fact of being conscious, something we typically are too busy to reflect upon during most of our conscious hours? The Nagelian something it is likeness is, in other words, no more than a synonym for consciousness itself. It has, however, been taken to supply a criterion for separating conscious entities from non-conscious ones, such as rocks. But it has no such power, because there are all kinds of things it is like to be a rock, such as being located in space and in time, having mass, being relatively solid, and so on. It is only that the rock itself has no knowledge or consciousness of these its properties or attributes, these some things it is like to be a rock. Nagel's something it is like must, in other words, be construed as something it is like in the sense of being experienced by the entity itself in order to make sense. It is only another name for the conscious state and does no more than to elide the consciously like that must be presupposed in order to render the something it is like coherent, but also trivial. Nevertheless, this something it is like has been taken to define a property, a distinctive qualitative characteristic possessed by the conscious state and by it alone, as an inherent identifying attribute inaccessible to physicalist elucidation on account of viewpoint dependence. Construed in this way, it has been taken to impose on students of consciousness an obligation to find an extra ingredient beyond the canons of ordinary physicalism, to be added to any proposed neural mechanism to supply the something it is like needed to qualify for conscious status on this view. As David Chalmers put it in his elaboration on the Nagel position, to account for conscious experience, we need an extra ingredient in the explanation. The extra ingredient beyond ordinary physicalism proposed by Chalmers is experience itself, construed as a fundamental feature of the universe alongside mass, charge, and space-time. A new putative primitive added to the basic ontology of nature to provide the extra ingredient needed to build an explanatory bridge over the chasm between mind and matter. Some think that Nagel's argument has opened up. Commitment to some such experience-related factor embedded in the very foundations of nature itself amounts to adopting some form of panpsychism, of which there are a number of speculative varieties discussed at length in David Chalmers' writings on the topic. Now, I could stop at this point. There is a bit more, but a couple of minutes more if you There is, of course, a striking and uncannily exact parallel to this presumed necessity for an extra ingredient beyond the physicalist canons of ordinary science in the controversy about vitalism that agitated biologists in the late 1800s and early 20th century. Vitalism is the conviction that the origin and phenomena of life itself are dependent on a force or principle distinct from purely chemical or physical forces. Vitalists insisted that life was not explicable in purely physicalist terms, but required an extra ingredient of some kind, a kind of life force, if you will, that went under names such as vis essentialis, entelechy, elan vital, etc. The lesson of vitalism for us is twofold. First, the inconceivability that drove the vitalist quest for an extra ingredient was converted into a most definite conceivability by basic research in biology that simply ignored the skepticism of the vitalists. Through a piecemeal process spanning many decades, an increasingly comprehensive physical account of living matter was assembled. It revealed that vitalism's life force not only lacked all explanatory power, but had served as a cognitive sedative, stifling scientific inquiry rather than stimulating it to break new ground. The second lesson we can draw from vitalism concerns how the triumph of the physicalist account of life itself was achieved. Every step of that many decades-long journey consisted in various ways of showing how mere incogitative matter must be organized or structured or configured in order to perform the functions of living beings, starting with a metabolic engine that pays the entropy bill of life. I'll just flash some slides by you to remind you. The Krebs cycle, 1937, structure, 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 in a cyclical structure, in turn embedded in a mitochondrion whose walls are studied with catalytic points for the Krebs cycle. 1953, DNA, not cyclical but helical. It works on purely structural grounds through template copying for self-replication and the manufacture and control of proteins. This is how it works, DNA copying. We know every last bit of detail of this. If you have these two, a metabolic engine and a template copying supercoiled control structure like DNA, you can put them both together in a package and have them manufacture a cell membrane that surrounds them. And you can arrange that production of the cell membrane in such a way that when it reaches a certain size, the replication machinery kicks in and divides the whole thing, like here, an amoeba dividing. At this point, at this point, the cells can go on. The rest of the story of life is just Darwin, Darwin, and more Darwin. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to some questions. How about we'll take first over here, and then I'll take you. Here.
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm wondering whether if you added, which I think Tom Nagel sometimes does to his formulation, what is it like for the bat to be a bat? You would agree there is a difference between the question concerning the bat and the question of what it is like to be a stone.
I said so, yes. I said so.
So then why?
I said that the difference is that the stone doesn't know it.
But then it is a very distinctly
Of course, but
important question. It cannot just be reduced.
It's the question of consciousness. But I'm saying what it is like doesn't add anything to saying it's conscious. What it is like is a synonym for consciousness.
But anyway, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so congratulations on explaining life. That's a great achievement. But I'm just curious about, just to bring it back to the topic of the conference, what do you think the line you're taking here actually has as its implications for animal consciousness? So, for example, even for the question which Tom was asking about what it's like to be a bat, is there a particular theory of consciousness that you're favoring here which has specific implications about what it's like to be a bat and will actually enable us to render that in an objective scientific story? Because I think that's the kind of the connection that would really start making serious progress on the question.
So if I'll read the last paragraph of I skipped many other things in my talk. If you remember my initial remarks about Thomas Kuhn, this is exactly the kind of things that go on in the pre-science stage of the history of discipline, where metaphysical issues often occupy center stage. So my take-home message is this: real answers from neuroscience regarding animal consciousness will have to await the day when the discipline of consciousness theory ends its pre-science days to become normal science by the elevation of one of its current or future theories to paradigmatic status. That hasn't happened yet. I have no doubt that that paradigm will fit comfortably in the framework of ordinary physicalist theory. And on that note, I thank you for your attention.
Very good.
Okay, Bjorn, it was a terrific talk, and this is not critical. Okay. First of all, would you have any objection to my replacing the many synonyms that you used for consciousness, including consciousness, by feeling, namely? Yeah. First question.
Yeah, I would have an objection to that, because feelings are only one content of consciousness among many. There are percepts, there are intentions, there are all these...
Does it feel like something to perceive something? Does it feel like something to intend something?
Not necessarily. To intend, yes, but to see something, not necessarily.
Why do you call it perception if it doesn't feel like anything? It sounds like detection. When we're talking about stones and electrodes detect the presence of an entity, but we don't say that they feel it unconsciously.
And the world, the Earth felt the impact of a meteor. The Earth felt, feeling has, well, and your thing is also just language. Well.
Here, concerning gamma band, you know, there are experiments that have been published where you can actually get rid of gamma band by removing so-called P channels, calcium channels, which suggests that cognition is calcium dependent and is frequency dependent. Calcium dependent and frequency dependent. Oh. So if you don't have that type of channel in this animal, which you can transvect, the animal survives, but is incapable of consciousness and actually cognition, and it dies not too long after reaching that level. So I think that it would be interesting to remove a whole lot of the mystery about this. I think to many of us, 40 hertz is related very directly to the ability to generate consciousness.
Yeah, the intervention of removing the K channels is a very drastic one.
Yeah.
So we would like a very more
P
precise.
channels.
I would love to have.
Pardon me?
Which one? P channels.
P. Yeah, like P.
P,
like
P
Peter.
channel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would love to have a more precise tool that takes out only the P channel, the P channel that supports.
I will send you the paper.
Okay, wonderful. Great.
Thank you.
And we have one back there.
Do I throw it or?
Okay, so to me it seemed like when you were talking about Nagel's paper, you were not willing to endorse that there can be consciousness without any content. You kept bringing up different contents that are components of consciousness, but there's nothing that it's like just to be conscious. And I was wondering about what you think about meditation, because I think that's one of the main goals of meditation is to reach this conscious state, this state where you're conscious, but there's no content of your consciousness. So I was wondering if you thought that meditation was just like, I don't know, malarkey, or if that's a possible thing.
No, I'm very familiar with the meditation practices and literature. The condition of pure consciousness that is a type of contentless consciousness that can be achieved in some meditative states is obviously a real phenomenon. Now, it doesn't mean that there is no content at all. It means, in a sense, that you are staring at a blank blackboard. There is a clinical analog to the pure consciousness state in meditation, which is called auto-activation deficit, whose patients say, oh, my mind just goes blank and there's nothing. And this is associated with basal ganglia and frontal cortex damage, and maybe there is a change in frontal and basal ganglia circuitry in these meditation states, which could duplicate this kind of blank, the mind going empty. Emptiness is one of the favorite words for this in meditation.
I'm going to take one more question.
I agree with you that the subjectivity of consciousness does not preclude an objective scientific study of the subject. And it's actually a common misunderstanding of that essay to interpret it as having made that claim. But where I part company with you is in your confidence that an objective theory of the remarkable phenomena of subjective points of view will be a physicalist theory. It still seems to me that this phenomenon requires an expansion of our conception of scientific objectivity to embrace a much richer potential conception of the universe than the physical science, remarkably rich as it is, that has developed since the scientific revolution. And I don't think that an appeal to the analogy of vitalism is adequate to dispel the problems for the prospects of a physicalist theory of consciousness. It's a very different case, and life, even at its most mysterious, was always, apart from consciousness, a phenomenon in the space spatiotemporal external world, which, one could conceive was reducible to something, the terms of physics. So why are you confident that it's going to be a physicalist theory?
I misquoted myself. My last line was, and on that note of hope, I thank you for your attention. In other words, I am no absolutist about physicalist explanations. What I'm saying is that neuroscience does not yet have that explanation, and therefore such an explanation might come in the future. I read your paper very carefully, and there are parts at the end of your paper where you clearly express that you also are no absolutist about your claims. Namely, you say there might be some structural aspects of perception which can lead us, which can give us a handle on some of these aspects of consciousness, and I perfectly agree. I never hear that part of your paper cited or quoted. There you leave a tiny bit of an open door to a physicalist account. And in the same way, I cannot be dogmatic because the theory is not yet there. We don't have a paradigm in neuroscience yet for consciousness. And therefore, I also leave a tiny little gap in the door for saying maybe something along your lines that you just told us about is possible.
So there's some common ground there, some possible
Yes.
slight door crack open on both sides. Okay, thank you so much, Bjorn. So it's a pleasure to introduce my next speaker, Michael Tighe, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He's made significant contributions in the realm of the philosophy of mind, and he's going to enlighten us on whether there is an on or off switch for consciousness in animal brains. Or on this computer. Let's see. Oh. Can we use that cord? Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, some philosophers have certainly thought that there is an on-off switch for consciousness in animal brains. John Searle, for example, 25 years ago said, consciousness is an on-off switch. A system is either conscious or it's not, but once conscious, the system is a rheostat. There are different degrees of consciousness. More recently, Dan Dennett commented, there's no principled way of distinguishing when or if the mythic light bulb of consciousness is turned on. Consciousness, I claim, even in the case we understand best, our own, is not an all or nothing phenomenon. So I found his comment that he agreed with everything that Peter said slightly strange today, but these are not the only alternatives. I mean, you could be a panpsychist, I guess, in which case you'd think that the light bulb is on always everywhere, since consciousness is a feature of microreality. I'm going to ignore that view. I'm going to suggest that consciousness did come on the scene suddenly, that there is an on-off switch for consciousness, one of these, and that in fact there's evidence for there being such a switch in a wide range of animal brains. First, a couple of comments about my use of the word consciousness. Some philosophers think that there are different concepts of consciousness. Ned Block's one, he distinguishes phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. I'm going to be focusing simply on phenomenal consciousness or experience. And I think we've had enough said about what that is for me not to need to say any more. So the question I want to address is whether there are borderline cases of phenomenal consciousness or experience. So I think that the answer to this question is no, at least if the term borderline is used in a non-epistemic way. I mean, obviously, we could encounter a simple creature and not know whether it's conscious or not, but that's really not germane to the issue I want to discuss. My claim is that the possession of consciousness itself is not a matter of degree. Now, if you disagree with me, try to think of a clear-cut, objectively borderline case of consciousness. I agree that you can certainly think of a case of consciousness which is indeterminate as to whether it's a case of pain, say. I was at the dentist a couple of weeks ago, and he was drilling away, and there were a bunch of sensations I was undergoing. It's very hard to classify them. Dan mentioned this a number of years ago. Some of them were sort of pressure-like, pain-like, very difficult to say. Here, I think it's actually indeterminate as to what you're feeling, but I don't think it's indeterminate as to whether you're feeling. Another example, you're in a hospital bed, feeling pain. You adjust a dial that controls the delivery of morphine to your body. So as you do this, the pain becomes less and less intense, gradually transforming itself into a feeling of pleasure. Now, in the middle of this process, you may well undergo experiences that it's difficult to classify. But again, in this case, there's indeterminacy as to what you're feeling, not indeterminacy as to whether feeling continues to be present. Last example, auditory sensations. You're participating in an experiment, listening to random high-pitched sounds through headphones. You're asked to press a button for each sound you hear. So on some occasions, you're unsure whether you're hearing any sound at all. You might say, look, aren't there going to be borderline cases of consciousness here? Well, first off, obviously, there are cases here by hypothesis in which there's epistemic indeterminacy. You don't know whether you're hearing a sound or not. But again, that isn't enough for there to be a borderline case of consciousness. I mean, you're listening attentively here. So either you're hearing a sound or you're not. If you are hearing a sound, then you're undergoing an experience. And if you're not hearing a sound, you're undergoing an experience because you're hearing silence. Hearing silence is experiencing the absence of noise. There's something it's like to experience silence. So either way, you're undergoing an experience. You might contrast this case with a case in which someone said that being tall is precise, that it has no borderline cases. Very easy to settle the dispute there. We simply bring someone forward who's not definitely tall and who also is not definitely not tall. And I think we can do the same with experiencing red. You know, is it red or orange or whatever you're experiencing? I mentioned feeling pain. Feeling happy, it's pretty easy to do as well. But can we do it with being an experience or being conscious? I don't think that we can. You know, if you have an experience and the intensity diminishes, it becomes less and less rich and definite in its character. But either an experience is still there or it isn't. You know, if you try and picture what it's like from the subject's point of view, you picture the experience gradually changing in its phenomenology, sort of washing out until it becomes minimal, and then suddenly it's gone. So the gradual transition there is in the number and intensity of the subjective features of the experience, not in the states being an experience. You might contrast this case with the case of life. I think the concept living is a functional behavioral cluster concept. I mean, living things use energy, they self-regulate, they adapt, they respond to their environment. What it is for something to be living is for it to have enough of features of that sort. So there will be borderline cases. Does this thing over here really have enough of those? Certain kinds of bacteria or organic molecules. So the result is that the transition, in the case of life, from clearly inanimate to clearly animate beings is gradual and continuous. But I'm one of those people that thinks in the case of consciousness, there is no a priori functional or behavioral definition. And that's why I think it's perfectly coherent to imagine a creature that is not conscious, a zombie, even though it's functionally and behaviorally just like a creature that is. So I think that in the case of consciousness, what happens is that it suddenly emerges and then in some very dim form and then gets richer and richer through time. Now, if we think of consciousness in that way as an on-off affair, then where is the switch located? So there was a hypothesis by Crick and Koch to the effect that the claustrum is the place where information underlying conscious perceptions is integrated into a harmonious conscious whole. The claustrum shown here, thin, irregular sheet of neurons under the cortex, blue on the left, green on the right. So one thought is that's where the switch for consciousness in humans is located. And there is some recent work that seems to support this conjecture. So Mohammed Kabesi and colleagues managed to stimulate the claustrum of a female subject and thereby turn her consciousness off and then back on again. Now the subject here had epilepsy, and they were trying to determine where in the brain her epileptic seizures originated. So they were putting deep brain electrodes in, and one of them was touching the claustrum, and they stimulated it, and suddenly she lost consciousness. She was still awake, but she was then staring straight ahead. She didn't respond to visual or auditory commands. When they stopped doing it, her consciousness returned. It wasn't that she was paralyzed. She had no memory of the period in which she seems to have lost consciousness. I gather they did this about 20 times over a couple of days. The problem with this conjecture is that there's at least one documented case, of which I'm aware, of an adult human subject lacking a claustrum who nonetheless undergoes experiences. So Damasio cites this case. It's a male subject who had his insular cortices and claustrum destroyed as a result of herpes simplex encephalitis. But even given that, all aspects of feeling remained intact. What that suggests is that the switch for consciousness is buried deeper than the claustrum, perhaps in the brainstem region, which was intact in this patient. And that's the hypothesis that Damasio himself favors. There's a long quote here. I don't have time to go through. I'll just read the last little bit. We subscribe to the hypothesis that feelings, ranging from the feelings of pain and pleasure to feelings of emotion, first emerged from the integrated operation of structures in the brainstem, hypothalamus, and the deep layers of the nearby superior colliculi, the brainstem complex. Now, there is a puzzle here, and maybe there's simply literature here of which I'm unaware, which solves it. But if the puzzle is this, if the switch for consciousness really is buried that deep, then why, in the case of Kabesi's subject, did consciousness disappear when the claustrum was electrically stimulated and reappear when it wasn't? There are things you can say here. You can say that she still had phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness had gone or something to that effect, but I won't pursue that. What I do want to say is it seems to me that there is further evidence in favor of Damasio's view in the human case. I have in mind here decorticate children. So there's no cortex there and no operational claustrum. Notwithstanding that, in the case of some children, and here I'm relying on Bjorn Merker's essay on the subject, there certainly seems to be experience and feeling. Merker points out that for a range of these children, certainly not all of them, there's behavior that's suggestive of experiences. Here you see a child watching a puppet as it's moved and starting to smile and giggle and then laughing. And these children sometimes show preference for certain situations, toys, and so on. So what's going on here? Well, here's one proposal. In the case of decorticate children who are conscious, the brainstem complex switch is on, as it were, and there is consciousness. And I think it's worth noting that in some other mammalian species, the impairment due to removal of the cortex shortly after birth is much less striking. So if you take rats, for example, they're surgically decorticated a few days after being born and then reared by a normal mother, they seem pretty little impaired by removal of the cortex. So this suggests a possible picture, namely that the integrated operation of structures in the brainstem complex generates representations of the immediate environment and the body and bodily states, And then those representations, is it okay? Okay, and then those representations become conscious via a binary process like the flipping of a switch. And then once conscious, the representations direct a range of actions. So what about other animals then, having said all this about humans? Well, in the Claustrum case, it looks as if we have evidence, at any rate, that if there's a properly functioning brainstem complex and claustrum, there's consciousness. And since mammals generally have these, we've got evidence that mammals generally are conscious. What about birds and fish? So let me say something about birds quickly first. So birds lack a neocortex, but they engage in some very complex behavior. Here you have a Caledonian crow bending a wire into a hook to get some food out of the bottom of this glass jar. Now, what's going on with birds at a neurophysiological level? So one proposal is that there are homologous cells in birds and human brains that mediate the kind of behavioral similarities we find between birds and mammals. You might wonder how that's possible if humans have a neocortex and birds lack one. If you think of the neocortex as a unique component of mammalian brains, that becomes even more puzzling. So one solution to this puzzle is to say, look, the neocortex didn't suddenly appear by magic in mammals. What happened was that certain sorts of cells present in non-mammalian brains and around for hundreds of millions of years were grouped into layers to form the laminar structure of the cortex. This is a proposal by Carton quite a while ago now. And that's what's genuinely new. But the constituent neuron types and the microcircuitry aren't new. The idea is that the relevant cells for birds are preserved in a structure of a vastly different shape from the neocortex, known as the dorsal ventricular ridge. And two of Carton's students very recently have shown that the cells in that area share the same physiological properties as the cortical cells. And it's also been hypothesized that within that region there's a homologous counterpart to the claustrum. Now, to my knowledge, this hasn't been settled in the case of fish, but it's worth noting that it has been speculated that there is a similar region in the forebrain of fish. I don't know of anything about whether there's a claustrum-like structure there. Now, given that we don't really have that much knowledge about the parallels here between what's going on in the forebrain of fish and birds and so on, how are we to address the question of consciousness in fish? So we have some people who've claimed quickly that since fish lack a neocortex, they can't feel pain or undergo any conscious states. So I just think that's too fast, given Professor Merker's observations of decorticate children and also the case I mentioned of decorticate rat. But there is an issue about how we are to address this question. I mean, what sorts of evidence is to count as relevant at the present time? Well, one sort of evidence, it seems to me, is presented by behavior. And in effect, this is an application of a rule formulated by Sir Isaac Newton in his Principia, to the effect that we're entitled to infer like cause from like effect unless there's defeating evidence. So the idea here is this: why should I believe that the rest of you undergo experiences like me? Well, you behave in the ways that I do as a result of various experiences and feelings, and that entitles me to think that a similar cause is operative in your case, producing a similar effect. I think that rule is best seen as providing the basis for rational preference instead of rational belief, but I don't have time to go into that here. Now, the rule, I think, should be seen in this way. We're entitled to infer similar cause from similar effect unless there's defeating evidence. So what would a defeater here be? Well, suppose you die, and I find out that your head is empty, and you have only an organic exterior. You're a Martian marionette. Well, that's pretty good defeating evidence. I should no longer prefer the view that you have experiences and feelings like me. Suppose I find out you're an android and that on the inside there's just a silicon chip with a complex lookup table controlling your behavior. Again, there's a defeater. I couldn't resist including this slide here.
You remember this scene? Kevin Kline on the right is eating Michael Palin's beloved tropical fish. He's tied up on the left. Kline is trying to find out the location of some stolen jewels. Palin's horrified. He thinks his fish have experiences of pain and fear, and Kline couldn't give a damn. So it sort of expresses the debate between the two sides here. You might notice there's a French fry stuck up Michael Palin's nose, which gives the scene a nice fish and chips symmetry to it. So here's, I think, how we should try to resolve that sort of debate. Think about the case of humans. Think about the pattern of behavior that the feeling of pain prototypically produces. I don't have much time, so I can't list these things, but there is a pattern of behavior that characteristically goes along with pain. Suppose we find in fish that there's a same pattern of behavior in response to noxious stimuli. Then I think it's rational for us at the present time to prefer the hypothesis that the feeling of pain causes that behavior to the hypothesis that some other cause is operative, again, unless we have further evidence that defeats that preference. And then additional confirmation is the cessation or reduction in that behavior given morphine or other opiates, as is the case with us, again, unless there's defeating evidence. So it turns out that the overall pattern of behavior in fish is indeed similar to ours, as is their reaction to opiates. So I think we should prefer the hypothesis that they feel pain too. Now, the question of defeaters comes up. So I don't think there's a clear defeater at the present time. The absence of a neocortex is not here a defeater, nor relatedly is the absence of a claustrum or claustrum-like physical structure, if it turns out that there isn't such. So I think when we turn to simpler creatures, the same methodology should apply. So there's some behavioral evidence that hermit crabs feel pain, and that honeybees feel anxiety. As I have in mind here, work by Bateson. So if this is right, then there is some reason to prefer the view that consciousness is to be found in the arthropod realm. And then if you accept what I said earlier, it's going to follow that there is a switch for consciousness in arthropod brains. Now, just very quickly, if there is a switch in their brains and there is a switch in ours, should we think that there is more than one origin for consciousness? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is a striking fact that there are a number of functional similarities between mammal and insect brains. And what that suggests is that there's some sort of common genetic package, perhaps, that's underlying and producing those similarities. And there are a suite of genes shared by, for example, mice and fruit flies. So what that suggests is that there's a common ancestor here, even though we don't have any fossil remains. There are some fossil traces. But I think at least one possibility is that consciousness suddenly emerged in some absolutely dim form a long time ago, even before insects evolved. So now we go back to finish to the quote from Dan with which I began. We said there's no principal way of distinguishing when or if the mythic light bulb of consciousness is turned on. So what I think we can do is to look inside the animal's brains and see if there are functioning structures like the claustrum and the brainstem complex found in mammals. We can also look at the animal's behavior. We find similar behavior there to ours. That gives us defeasible evidence that non-human animals are subject to similar mental states. So I don't think that the light bulb is mythic. I think it's real, and we don't get into terrible trouble from acknowledging its existence. Thank you.
I'm going to use my privilege as a chair to ask the first question. So I agree with the points of, since we have a similar evolutionary history and they behave in a similar way when they're looking as if they're experiencing pain, and these arguments for why we can attribute feeling sensations to other animals. I think it gets a little bit more tricky when you start using evidence saying that humans don't need a cortex for consciousness as an argument why other animals who don't have a cortex will have consciousness, especially using the anencephalitic children argument, because some could say, well, if you take a fully grown human adult, remove their cortex, they're not going to have they're not going to be conscious. But if you're born that way, one idea is that first of all, it's just reflexive, those responses, that they're not necessarily conscious, and the other is that perhaps if you're born that way, some of those midbrain structures develop to take on some of the properties of what a cortex might take on. That's a better argument for what's perhaps happening in animals. So I think, you know, taking that line is to be cautious of that. And I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that perspective.
So basically, I agree. That sounds right to me. I'm not making any claim here to the effect that an adult later in life who completely loses any activity in the cortex is thereby conscious. It looks as if what goes on with some of these decorticate children, and I mean, I'm not an expert on this, all I can do is to cite others, is that some subcortical neurons, which would normally pass on information to cortical neurons, in the absence of the cortical neurons, take on certain jobs themselves. And that's why, for example, apparently, some of these children with absolutely no cortex at all do better than some which have a tiny amount of cortex, because in the latter case, the subcortical neurons pass on information to the cortical neurons that are left, and they're functionally abnormal, so you get sort of very bad vision, for example, whereas if there aren't any there, then the subcortical neurons take over themselves. The point simply is that those people who say, look, we have a clear defeater here, because in this organism there is no neocortex, that seems to me too fast. That's not in itself a good reason to ignore the behavior that we're seeing produced.
Okay. Dan?
Thanks, Michael. I
thank you.
Want to dig in my heels in your early point about how, although you could see there were there were boundary cases between whether it was a pain or not, so forth. You could not imagine intermediate cases where there was a question of whether or not there was a conscious experience at all. And I found that argument, if it was an argument, completely unconvincing. You yourself later talked about how then there would be a conscious experience, and went on to say, and the contents would direct actions in the future. Well, what if we hugely restrict the sequelae of a state, so there's almost no action it can direct, no response directed? At what point do you say, well, now it's not conscious at all? It may have a certain content, but it's, as usual, of course, I'm saying, you've got to ask and answer the hard question. And then what happens?
Sorry, I'm not sure how to respond to that. Are you suggesting here that we have a case which is such that when we think about it, we say to ourselves, aha. So here it's genuinely indeterminate as to whether an experience is present.
Yes.
So what is the case exactly again?
Well, it is an artifact of this thought example method that you're adopting, that I can't give you a case, because any case that I could give you from the first person point of view would be one which, of course, had a voluminous plethora of sequelae that I could list. I could go on for hours about all the ways I could react to that. So it has to be a case that I am necessarily inarticulate about, unable to remember, and so forth. And the claim that there are no such cases is simply an argument from ignorance.
Well, it does seem to me slightly strange that we should have such difficulty in adducing such a case when we don't
induce them all the time.
Well, I mean, I could understand it if you said to me, look, in cases of anesthesia, for example, or falling asleep, it's indeterminate whether consciousness is present, and then I could try and give you a response to that. But I mean, what I'm suggesting is that if you don't come up with a definite case of that sort, then it seems to me dialectically you're in a slightly strange position. I mean, if in the case of being tall or being rich, it's very easy to adduce someone, and then it just settles the dispute. Here's a borderline tall man, here's a borderline rich man. But in the case where someone thinks it's a borderline case of consciousness, I think, as I reflect on those cases, what I end up thinking is that the indeterminacy is with respect to what is experienced. It's indeterminate as to what is experienced, not whether experience is present, which is why I'm sort of sympathetic to some of the things that Peter said about consciousness and the step function in global broadcasting. Sorry.
I won't pursue that further now.
Okay,
I'll get my licks in later.
Okay.
So it's rare for me to agree with Dan, but here's the paradox in your view. It seems to me, it's that you are a scientific realist about consciousness.
Yeah.
But as soon as you're a scientific realist, that opens the door to borderline cases. Whatever consciousness is, it's something physical, something neurological, biological in the brain. And then there's going to be a very high likelihood of borderline cases.
Are you suggesting that as soon as you take any sort of physicalist view of consciousness, there are two different views here. One is scientific, one is realism. There is consciousness. Then a second view is scientific realism, understood as a thesis that there is consciousness and it's physical. Now, you're suggesting, or functional. You're suggesting that as soon as we adopt the latter view, then we're going to have to admit borderline cases of consciousness. Yeah. So that's not obvious to me at all. I mean, it seems to me pretty clear that in the physical domain, there are plenty of properties that we think of as sharp.
Well, in the domain of basic level physics, but not in the domain of neuroscience. In neuroscience, there are no sharp properties.
Yeah, I just don't get it, Ned. That's pretty much what I was about to say.
We'll take one more question, Ava, and then bring on the other speakers for discussion.
Yeah, I'm very much in the same direction, and I'm taking an evolutionary view. Now, you were talking about life, and you say this is a cluster concept. We have, and you showed this picture where we have a membrane, an autocatalytic cycle, and some kind of replicating polymer, and they're all coupled. That's very nice. We know quite a lot about life as we know it, and we know far less about consciousness. But if consciousness evolved, which probably is the case, if you're a physicalist about this kind of things, then we have to assume that there was some kind of gradual evolution. It doesn't mean to say that there aren't threshold phenomena during evolution, but there are not many of them. And usually, you do see the precursors of the whatever structure. You can say, well, at some point there weren't any wings and creatures couldn't fly, and then there were. But if you're looking at it, well, they sort of glided, they sort of moved in this and that way, and so on. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case with consciousness, but given our, at the moment, ignorance about what constitutes with the kind of processes and the kind of structures in different brains that constitute consciousness, I think it is very likely that we will find, as we do with life, and at the theoretical level at the moment, that there may well be a kind of cases where it is impossible for you to say whether or not a system is conscious. You can only say positively once it is, or at the other end when it isn't. But there will be cases where you just could not evolutionarily say so. And if I'm going back to the common ancestor of arthropods and vertebrates, well, there are a lot of disputes about that. But certainly, when you're thinking about cephalopods, unless you're assuming that the common ancestor also included the mollusks, then we have a case of consciousness which I think is well argued for cephalopods. So and that happened to about 300 million years after the Cambrian explosion, which is where the other two phyla appeared.
Yeah.
So. Right. So this is again. So there may well be an independent origin here, may well be also with arthropods, and I just don't see evolutionarily how you can be sure about this discontinuity when everywhere I look, as an evolutionary biologist, I see some form of continuity, some form.
Well, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, when consciousness came on the scene, something rather remarkable came on the scene, which is why we think there's a hard problem of consciousness. And So something, as it were, strange happened there. Now, it could be, as you say, that prior... Well, I don't think we think there's a hard problem of life, or at least some of us, in the same way that we think there's a hard problem of consciousness. Now, it may well have been that prior to consciousness coming on the scene, there were various characteristics not involving consciousness that had some of the functional characteristics of consciousness. And then suddenly, as it were, to use the metaphor again, the light went on, and then consciousness took over and did more easily these things that were done less well prior to its occurring.
I just thought I'm going to bring up Peter and Bjorn to have a little bit more. We can sit down and have a discussion between everybody, and I'll take more questions. Come on. Are they on? There you go.
On.
You want to sit down? So I'm going to start with a question. I think, well, first I just wanted to make the distinction between like consciousness sort of as wakefulness versus consciousness of specific contents, right? So when we talk about an on-off switch in the brain, whether it's a subcortical area or the Claustrum, and there's argument about that, but either way, that's sort of, you're awake with the capacity to potentially have contents of consciousness, or you're not, which is different than a fully awake brain and then determining whether it's conscious of a particular thing or not, right? So I think the switch that we're talking about is more to do with being a fully awake brain that has the capacity to have conscious content or not. But the overarching question, I think, is, is the rate limiting step here a factor that we haven't found the neural basis of, or neuroscientists can't agree on the neural basis of consciousness, but if we eventually can, then that will be the explanation for everything across other animals? Or even if, let's say, we do find or we agree on a theory of neural basis of consciousness in humans, is that going to necessarily apply to other animals, for instance, on other, like the octopus, for example? So, yeah, that's my first question, and then I'll open it up.
Okay. Shall I start? Yeah. I think my bets are on the fact that when theories of consciousness in neuroscience start dealing with the viewpoint dependence of consciousness, that is the first step towards actually cracking the problem, because it's another one of these inconceivabilities. I can't conceive of consciousness without the viewpoint dependence, and in that I think Thomas Nagel was absolutely right. And the reason I'm not a global workspace theorist is that the Barr's theater of consciousness is a very, very strange theater. The audience is unconscious. There is no observer present. There is only the highlight, the spotlight in the focus of attention on the stage, but there is no conscious observer. And so so it doesn't have a viewpoint dependence. Nonni also doesn't have viewpoints built into it. So there are now two in the literature, two viewpoint-dependent format-based theories of consciousness. One is my own, which I call global best estimate theory, and the other one was published this year in the Journal of Theoretical Biology by David Woodruff, and Carl Friston is in that group. They call it the theory of the projective consciousness model, and it's built on projective geometry with completely viewpoint-based. And I wrote to David Woodruff and asked him if he would agree to have him listed as a viewpoint-dependent. He was ecstatic about it. So there are two viewpoint-dependent theories of consciousness in neuroscience now. I don't know if we are right, but I think that's the path of progress.
Anyone else, or should I open it up?
I think it would be nice if we could construct a theory of consciousness which not only acknowledged viewpoint dependence, but also acknowledged the fact that there are no borderline cases of consciousness. And we should use that as a test for various theories of consciousness. So if someone gives us a functionalist theory of consciousness, and that theory is one which allows for borderline cases, that seems to me to be a reason to question the theory. If someone gives us a theory of consciousness and it doesn't have viewpoint dependence in it, that seems to me a reason to question the theory.
One quick comment on the on-off. There is a very nice, from Indian philosophy, there is a very nice scale of sentience, and it has 4 steps. And it very, very clearly brings out that what Michael Tighe is talking about is the contents are obviously graded, but the fact of being conscious is not. The Indian scale of sentience goes like this. The first step, the most primitive step, this. Just anything, this. However primitive, however inchoate, this. It's still conscious, this. The second step, this is so, predication. Third step, I am affected by this which is so. Fourth step, so this is I who am affected by this which is so. Very nice, I think.
Yes.
So I want to just say something about, is this thing on?
Yeah, sure. And then I'll take you over here.
A switch is functionally defined. I mean, that's what switches do. They mediate between other things. They get the electricity flowing through the system. So taking that analogy seriously, we'd say, well, what's going on in the claustrum or in the brainstem is mediating other events, and then you need to know what those events are, and for sure they'll admit of degrees across species. So I don't see that finding a switch that is on and off in humans or on and off in other creatures answers the problem. You're still going to be left with degrees of the functional organization of that system and degrees of what it is that we have.
I actually, what I'm about to say kind of touches on the same question. I mean, so when we're talking about on-off switches, there are kind of 2 methods of approach. You can have like an argument from on high. I mean, suppose you think that there is an on-off switch. I guess I'm mainly directing this at Michael, but I hope we all can participate. Suppose you do think there's an on-off switch. You can either have like an argument from on high where you say, well, you know, here's what vagueness is and here's what concepts are, and or you can have like an argument from cases, you know, look, I think this is the right theory of consciousness, and you know, it implies that the claustrum is the thing, and the claustrum turns out to be on off. I mean, you know, for example, Michael Anthony has a series of papers giving an on-high argument that there can't be borderline cases of consciousness, and I have a Phil Studies paper making a related, like, from on-high argument. And I'm just wondering, like, ultimately how you think the methodology goes, because if you are coming from on high, then it's easy to say to, like, you know, Ned or Dan, well, look, I think this is the fact that there are no borderline cases of consciousness is a constraint on an adequate theory, and so if physicalism is going to be true, you know, we better hope that we can find a good physicalist theory that gives us the on-off switch. On the other hand, if you're just coming up and saying, hey, look, I think it's the claustrum or the global workspace, and hey, look, it looks like there's a step function, then yeah.
No, I'm thinking of it in the former way. I mean, I just very quickly, parenthetically add that even though the position that Peter developed is one that I've held for quite some time, I don't find myself as willing nowadays to embrace it so warmly as I have in the past. You know, Sidney Shoemaker many years ago said, au fond, I'm not sure why he lapsed into French here, but anyway, he said, au fond, aren't we all anti-physicalists? And that remark has stayed with me. These issues, the standard ones of the explanatory gap and others, they're ones to which physicalists can respond, and I've done so myself in the past, but I still have a worry there. And the reason in the end why I embraced physicalism was that I thought that there was no adequate account of the causal efficacy of conscious states if one is not a physicalist. So very recently it's occurred to me that there's a way of doing this, and without being a physicalist. And under that kind of picture, one ends up thinking of the contents of consciousness in still a representational way, but the basic fact of consciousness is itself not physical. And that then would fit with these conceptual points. So that's just an autobiographical comment about how these things sort of fitted together in my own thought.
Peter over here, question?
Thanks. On the evolutionary part of Michael's talk, in the sense of consciousness that you're talking about, I don't think there's much chance of single origins. And the reason is that even if the bilaterian last common ancestor is much more complicated than had been thought, which is possible. Between that guy and the octopus, you've got some very generic mollusks with, very unlikely to have any behavioral complexity. They were shellfish, essentially. So even Nicholas Straussfeld, who's one of the advocates of a much more complicated bilaterian last common ancestor than most people, he thinks that the complexity you might infer is present there from looking at a fruit fly on one side and a vertebrate on the other. The plan that may have been present there is not shared in the octopus. They built the whole thing again on the basis of a much more simple sort of shellfish type nervous system.
Okay.
So I think single origin is
wishful thinking.
Yeah, well, I like multiple origins myself. I find it a happy thought, but unlikely.
Yeah, fine, thank you.
Take Will there, William.
So I'm interested in all the panelists' understanding of information in a physicalist view, whether it be DNA or the firing of the circuits or language, and whether that's can be understood completely in a physicalist content as metaphysics.
Okay, so let me go first. Yes, I think it can. So I think that you can start with a notion of reliable causation. So if one thing reliably is caused by another, it carries information about it. Neuron firing reliably carries information about stimulus at the outside. Fit that into a system of downstream use of the information in question, right? So I'm inclined to think that intentional content is a function of reliable causation and inferential role or causal role. Okay.
I don't have much to add to that. In the basic perceptual case, the kind of model that I've liked for understanding representation is the one that Fred Dretske presented in his book Explaining Behavior, under which basic perceptual representation is grounded in a biological indicator function. So if you take the case of detection of edges, there are certain cells that represent the presence of edges in firing in the visual field, let's suppose. How do they do that? Well, it's their biological function to indicate the presence of cells, and it's in virtue of that that they come to represent them. But that account, I think, is in effect a variant on the account that Peter was mentioning.
Right here? Here.
Yes, getting back to this point of whether there are no borderline cases of consciousness that Michael Tighe was talking about, I also find it very unconvincing. And what about patients that have minimal consciousness states, for instance, or you can have brain damage with all degrees of damage? So, and also with anesthesia, with propofol anesthesia, you can bring the patient to all different levels. So you are talking about that the consciousness itself is all or none, but that it can be more or less dim. But to me, that's just words. I mean, why isn't the dimming of the content just the same as the grading the consciousness itself? And there was mentioned action potentials here, that they are definitely all in on, but they are not. There can be local responses that are sort of intermediate with a full-blown action potential and not. So I think everything in biology can be graded, and I think this also is probably graded.
A quick comment on the minimally conscious patients. I think it's a very unfortunate terminology that has developed, and that terminology has developed because the clinical neurologists have been caught with egg on their face after classifying a lot of patients as vegetative state who were actually conscious when checked quickly. So now, as the first retreat position, they developed this concept of minimally conscious state. But if they are minimally conscious, they are conscious. There are some things that they have an impoverished content, but I agree with Michael Tighe on that. That impoverished content is consciously apprehended. And therefore, I think it's a most unfortunate development And I think it'll be another 10 or 20 years till we get another international committee that sits down and thrashes through all that we know now about anencephalic and hydranencephalic children, and to give an adequate classification. And I think they should be classified according to the contents of their consciousness. The children I have studied have profound dementia. Radically impoverished contents of consciousness compared to an adult human, but the switch is on, so to speak, in Michael Tighe's words.
Dan?
I'm surprised that you say that about the minimally conscious and locked-in cases. Adrian Owen's work seems to give lots of examples of cases which are not, he certainly does give cases, and these are the shocking ones, of people who are very definitely conscious, even though they were locked in. But he also gives cases where they search and search and search, and they try to establish that, and they don't. They get these little hints. And the line, there is no principled line, Adrian will say so, between the cases that really are vegetative and the case, and in between those and the cases of people with locked-in syndrome, there is a whole variety of different sets of capabilities. So it seems to me, however embarrassing it is to the clinicians that they ignored the locked-in cases, or that they misclassified those, that doesn't mean that there isn't a gradient there.
It's not the locked-in cases I'm referring to. I'm referring to anencephalic and hydranencephalic children. And the difficulty, what you're describing, that whole spectrum of things, I would classify as a spectrum of the contents of consciousness. And the difficulty is because these people have an intact cerebrum. They have the cerebral hemispheres, and they are pockmarked by very irregular and trauma to the head and so on. And those mosaics of damage and intact tissue create tremendous problems in terms of the functioning of the brain. So there can be these flickers, but in terms of once the criteria they are getting better and better now at finding appropriate tests for ferreting out even a glimmer of it, and to the extent that it's conscious, it is, and the content is terribly impoverished, but
I think
consciously apprehended.
It highlights the sort of main problem here is that until we have an overarching theory of consciousness, what is, what isn't, we won't know. So in a fully intact cortex in these people who are in different vegetative states, you can stimulate them with give them a shock or something. You'll get activation in the primary pain area, let's say, of the brain, or primary auditory cortex, but then that activation doesn't spread, right? And in a fully awake person, you see an activation, primary pain areas, and then it spreads across the cortex. So the question is, if you're just getting local activation, let's say in primary sensory areas, is that enough for consciousness? Are they feeling anything? We're not going to know until we really can agree on an overarching theory of consciousness, and whether an animal has it or a fetus or whatnot. Ned?
Sorry, just very quickly. I mean, there is a methodological issue here. It's not as if absolutely independently of how the organism or individual behaves, we're going to be able to justify accepting a particular theory of consciousness. Surely a relevant factor in our decisions about whether consciousness is present is whether there is any behavior of a sort we associate with consciousness. So, I mean, if one of the things that Peter said was that, well, there's no question to be asked once we've got complete knowledge of all the physical and functional facts, then what is added if we add that consciousness is present? Well, the reason he says that is because he's assuming that consciousness itself is a state that meets certain constraints. It's a functional state which has a certain content, a certain kind of content. But the issue is still, well, why should we accept that account than some other? And it seems to me, again, an important factor in our considerations here is the behavior of the organism. If that's not relevant, it's hard for me to see how to make progress at all.
Let me jump in on that. Yes, behavior is important, but lots of behavior in humans is caused by mental states that are not conscious mental states. So you can't just look at an animal behaving and say, oh, look, it's behaving, it's responding to the environment in an environment-sensitive way, and argue that consciousness is present. So, I mean, I'm thinking of, say, Milner and Goodale's stuff on the details of action control. When you see his patient posting a letter through a letterbox, folk psychologically, one would say, yeah, of course, she sees the orientation of the letterbox. That's why she put it vertically rather than horizontally. But she sees no such thing on a conscious level. She is a chance in distinguishing vertical from horizontal.
So along the same lines as Peter's comment, I think the two of you on the right, Michael and Bjorn, are overweighting behavior. Behavior is not only caused by unconscious mental states, it's caused by states that aren't mental at all. And in the case of the anencephalic babies or children, we have an evolutionary account of why they may act in such a charming way, even if there's no mentality there at all. Namely, evolution produced these little, newborns who have very little wired up cortex. But if they're not charming, they're going to be thrown away, because why should the parents do anything with them? They're really an annoying little thing. So nature made them charming, and nature made subcortical structures produce behavior that we react to in a very positive way. That behavior just isn't any indication of mentality, even unconscious mentality.
I agree perfectly that there is a problem there. It's not only the charming smiling, it's the my evidence is not simply some reaction like a smile to a puppet or something, but the integrated, situationally appropriate. My only claim ever has been that these children are not in a vegetative state because there are no such reflexes in nature as in other words, if you want to call them reflexes, they are far too sophisticated to be reflexes.
I didn't say reflexes. That's putting a false view on the opposition here. They're integrated behavioral programs that are meant by evolution to charm you.
Yeah. I cannot say that all I can say is that by the clinical classification criteria of vegetative state, they are not vegetative. So what are they? That's the question I have raised. I have not said that I have proved that they are conscious. I cannot prove that Ned Block is conscious. I would never dream of it. Or the only person I know for sure is conscious is myself. So there is no way around that argument. That is an absolute barrier to knowledge. But given that barrier, we have to do the best we can. And in these children, I have at least raised the question mark.
And I guess, like what you're saying, it's not enough to just say they're not in a vegetative state, because a fully non-vegetative person who's sleepwalking can do really complex things without having any conscious awareness. So you need more there to the argument to get to that point. I'm going to take one more question. And
well, can I add one quick comment? Some of the stuff I was reading on the decorticate rats, if it's done early enough afterwards, they seem very little impaired. So one of the researchers commented that he gave rats, some decorticated, some not, the task of searching out and finding Fruit Loop cereal pieces. And he said the decorticate rats did as well as the non-decorticate rats. They just had more trouble in picking them up to eat them. That's suggestive of the view that I was proposing.
So I'm hoping all of you can address this this question. Yesterday, a number of speakers were talking about a kind of a sequence or layering to consciousness, or the contents of consciousness, depending on how you think about it, with names such as primary consciousness or exteroceptive consciousness, in which there's a sort of an environmental field as the content of consciousness. and then that would get layered with various complexities in evolutionary time. But I didn't hear any of you today talking in those kinds of terms, so I wonder, since a number of speakers had that as a structure or paradigm yesterday, if you all could address that within what you talked about today.
So what I was talking about throughout was supposed to be phenomenal consciousness, which I think of as a certain kind of experiential state. Sorry, back up. Dan doesn't like me to use experience there. A certain kind of perceptual state, right, where it can be interoceptive, exteroceptive, and it's a perceptual state that plays a certain kind of a role, and in virtue of that is phenomenally conscious. But it doesn't have to have any sort of fancy extra layers of identifying the self or identifying one's own mental states as such or any of that kind of thing. It can be a purely first-order perceptual state.
I think we can leave it there to close it up. I think, though, Bjorn wanted to show a quick little 4-second video, and maybe we can do it as we're wrapping up here, that just shows a zebrafish larvae, I believe. Activation, very diverse cortical, not cortical, just activation in a zebrafish larvae video. And thank you guys very much. Yeah.
This one. Yeah. It's this one. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, why don't you do it?
Okay, why don't we just play the video as everyone goes to lunch. For lunch, everyone's on your own. We'll reconvene back here at 1:30. So thanks again.
This is a light bulb going on in a zebrafish. The light bulb going on in a zebrafish.
That's pretty cool, yeah. Yeah. Where did you get that?
I found it on the internet someplace.
Okay, this is a zebrafish?
Larva. The whole fish is 3 millimeters long.
Wow.
It's amazing. And
Yeah.
it's calcium in it.